All right, I think we can get going. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Cohen. I am the director of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. I also teach in the philosophy department at Georgia State University. And I'm also delighted to be the faculty advisor for the Zeta chapter in Georgia for the Philosophy Honor Society Phi Sigma Tau, which is the main sponsor for today's event. Before I turn it over to Gabby and Alex to get the event going, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind people to please take advantage of the many events that the Ethics Center and other campus co-sponsors are bringing to the Georgia State University community this semester. Dr. Reynolds' visit today is part of our Spring 2021 series, Ethical Dialogues Across the Virtual University, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. The next event scheduled for this series is 2 weeks from today at this time on Friday, March 26, featuring Professor Jose Mendoza from the University of Washington, who will be speaking on the topic, Go back to where you came from, racism, white nationalism, and xenophobia. That talk as well is going to be sponsored by the students of Phi Sigma Tau Zeta. I'm now going to turn the event over to Gabby Jung from Phi Sigma Tau. Gabby.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am the president of the student group Phi Sigma Tau, and this is Alex. He's the vice president of Sigma Tau. Before I turn things to Dr. Joel Reynolds, I'd like to give a short introduction to what he has done and his amazing work in disability. So Dr. Joel Reynolds is assistant professor of philosophy and disability studies at Georgetown University. He's a senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and a senior advisor to the Hastings Center and a core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program. He is also the founder of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability. Dr. Joel Reynolds' research is especially concerned with the meaning of disability, the issue of ableism, and how philosophical inquiry into each might improve the lives of people with disabilities and justness of institutions ranging from medicine to politics. He is the author and co-author of over 24 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and books. For example, he has a book forthcoming named The Life Worth Living, Disability, Pain, and the History of Morality. He also has 2 books working in progress, The Meaning of Disability and The Philosophy of Disability and Introduction. His public philosophy has been featured in Time, HuffPost, The Conversation, Health Progress, and in a Text Talk. Currently, he is the co-director of a 2-year NEH Public Humanities project, The Art of Flourishing, Conversations on Disability and Technology. He's the chair of the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophies Committee on Accessibility, Disability, and Inclusion. He's also a board member of the Society for Philosophy and Disability. So today we're pleased to have Dr. Joel Reynolds to give us a talk titled, We're All Somebody's Child, Disability, Speciesism, and the Problem of Dehumanization. Please, let's welcome Dr. Reynolds, and Joel, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and many thanks to you, Gabby, and to Alex, to GSU's Phi Sigma Tau student group for the very kind invitation. Many thanks to Andrew Cohen and the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, and also to Donna Hardaway for a bunch of logistical support. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. At the outset, I want to thank a number of people, all of those with whom I've had conversations over the years that ended up enriching this particular piece. So I want to especially thank Rosemary Garland Thompson, Eva Kate, Ali Peabody Smith, Erik Parens, Lauren Gilmet, Jen Scurro, Harold Braswell, and Adam Newman. In terms of accessibility housekeeping, of course, if something, as we have all learned with Zoom, if something's going wrong, please interrupt me. Please, the talk is less important than people being able to access things, and technology goes awry in all sorts of ways. So we'll do our very best here. Before I get rolling, here's a little bit of background to this paper. I am one of those people who, upon encountering Peter Singer's views about disability, found my jaw drop to the floor and my heart drop into my stomach. Now, there were multiple reasons for this, but in my case, the most relevant one is pretty easy to pick out. His arguments implied that Schnurp, yes, my dog really wants some attention, so he needed, yes, thank you. Yes, I love you too. Back to the seriousness. All right, so Peter Singer's arguments implied that it would have been permissible for my own parents to kill my younger brother after he was born. As Singer put it as early as 1985, which is actually the year I was born, in a book with Helga Kuza, it would have been permissible for my parents to kill my brother Jason at least up until 28 days after his birth. The why 28 and not 27 or 29 was and still is, I think, ultimately arbitrary. I don't think Singer ever attempted to defend that precise number philosophically, at least not to my knowledge. But my family history was by no means the only horizon of interpretation that led my jaw and my heart to drop. You know, I first read Singer's work many years after being mentored by an intellectual historian at the University of Oregon. His name is Joseph Fracchia, and his work and his pedagogy often engage the Holocaust and the meaning, you know, what it means to live in a post-Shoah world. And the concerns regarding dehumanization that were at play in things like the Holocaust, they were at the forefront of Professor Fracchia's mind whenever he was talking, whether he was talking about Plato's Republic or Conrad's Heart of Darkness, it didn't matter. This was always a concern of his. And this paper then is in many ways an attempt not just to think through a very troubling thought relative to my life personally, but also to honor the work of intellectual historians like Joseph Fracchia, who are deeply concerned about processes of dehumanization that lead to things like genocide, as well as to honor the work of people like Eva Gate and Rosemary Garland-Thompson, who have been trying, and Harriet McBride Johnson, who have all been trying to point out the multiple problems with Peter Singer's way of approaching this subset of questions. And if, not to give away the thesis too quickly, but if I'm right, that capacity-based utilitarian views like that of Singer share in many of the central features of the psychological processes that underwrite dehumanization. And if one further finds that those are processes that humans should be using every tool at our disposal to fight against, then we should just let go of that aspect of Singer's view, I think, once and for all. And crucially, this is going to cost us, I will hope to convince you, nothing in the fight for animal rights, right? I largely agree with Singer about the value of many non-human animals. That's very important to me. And I hope to convince you today that we can hold on to everything Singer wants to, and animal rights defenders want to, by simply raising the moral status of certain non-human animals to that of human animals. So with that set up, I'll begin. And I'll begin with two epigraphs. The first one is from someone I've already mentioned a few times, Rosemary Garland-Thompson. This comes from a piece she wrote that kicked off the New York Times disability series. This piece is entitled Becoming Disabled, and she writes, confused responses to racial or gender categories can provoke the question, what are you? Whereas disability interrogations provoke the question, what's wrong with you? And the second quote is from David Livingstone Smith, from an article of his entitled Paradoxes of Dehumanization. And he writes, when we dehumanize others, we regard them as simultaneously human and non-human, end quote. Over the last 50 years, debates concerning speciesism underwent a historic reversal. For a significant majority of the Western intellectual tradition, what we today call the species line functioned as a marker of not just biological and physiological difference, but also moral, political, and spiritual difference. Though articulated in different ways across epochs and across traditions, the theoretical dominance of the great chain of being held strong. Today, however, to assert the species line as such, a marker, calls out for charges of empirical ignorance as well as moral consternation, especially given recent discoveries about the social life as well as more specific cognitive processes of other organisms, ranging from octopuses to ravens to elephants to bumblebees, and ranging from practices that such creatures engage in, such as grieving the dead, playing games, and quite complex levels of abstraction. The idea that the species line in and of itself is determinate for moral worth has come to be largely pillory. There is, however, a cost to this reversal. Scholars from a range of traditions and specialties have argued that anti-speciesism, at least as defended by its primary proponents via a capacity-based view, diminishes the standing of and even banishes certain people, certain human animals, from the moral universe. Namely, it banishes those with certain types of impairments that can be a result of birth, a result of events across the life course, or any number of inevitable processes of aging. Now, for simplicity, I will henceforth refer to the many concerns that result from disagreements over the proper role of the species line. I'm just going to refer to this as the problem of speciesism. So scholarship concerned with the exclusion of certain disabled people from the anti-speciesist orbit, on the whole, has anchored arguments in moral traditions that center upon questions of distributive justice and equity, such as certain versions of social contract theory. I'm thinking of Nussbaum's modifications to Rawls, and also care ethics, thinking of people like Eva Kittay and Joan Tronto. On the contrary, scholarship concerned with the moral indefensibility of the species line, and less concerned about inclusion of certain people with disabilities, has often anchored arguments in moral traditions that center on questions of pain and pleasure, and the capacity for suffering, or on moral features like duty. So I'm thinking of people like Singer, and then I'm thinking of people who have modified a roughly Kantian framework like Christine Korsgaard. Perhaps unsurprisingly, much of this debate feels like each side is just arguing past each other as if ships in the dead of night. While to be sure, disagreement between these two camps is in part a consequence of the fate of different priors, of different theoretical frameworks, premises, inferences, and intuitions. This is not, and I don't think it should be, it should not be, the end of the story. The aim of this paper is to argue that the problem of speciesism, especially, but not solely in relationship to disability, ultimately turns not on moral traditions or on normative principles or on obligations or any other such thing. It instead turns on how humans in fact tend to treat and think about one another. That is to say, we should stop looking and should not look primarily to ethics to address the problem of speciesism. We should turn to the fields of social psychology and intellectual history. I'll argue that upon looking to these fields, it becomes clear, I think, that speciesism is ultimately related to dehumanization, to a way of thinking, a habit of thinking that one finds across the historical record and that has underwritten, or that underwrites actively, the psychological mechanisms behind mass murders, behind rape, behind torture, behind all sorts of other atrocities. And on this view that I'll be putting forward today, anti-speciesist arguments without an anchor in how we in fact tend to treat and think about each other should be viewed as prima facie suspect, for they disregard or they actively ignore the historied, well-documented problem that dehumanization presents, as well as the millions upon millions of deaths and destruction of life in various ways it has motivated over the historical record. I'll begin today by surveying social scientific and historical scholarship on genocide, hate crimes, and other forms of treating people as non-human. And I'll be drawing upon the work of people including David Livingston Smith, Sylvia Wynter, and excuse me, Richard Rorty. Among the many possible results of processes of dehumanization, one of them involves regarding certain human progeny to be simply not human in the sense of not being persons with respect to their value. And this, tellingly, is the precise outcome of Peter Singer's solution to the problem of speciesism. So I will then turn to Peter Singer's work, arguing that on his own account, of various ways to include, and I think rightly include, certain non-human animals as part of the moral universe, he indefensibly dismisses the most promising way to uphold both human and non-human animal rights, namely by preserving equality through raising the status of animals to that we currently grant to humans. By instead avoiding this path, by instead choosing to abandon the idea of the equal value of all humans, Singer endorses a route that, in light of the best research available in social psychology and intellectual history, instead actively supports the psychological and larger political mechanisms behind practices of dehumanization. So let's get going. Section 1, dehumanization. Near the outset of David Livingstone Smith's 2020 book on Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It, he quotes an SS booklet from 1942. It reads as follows: "Although it, the Jew, has features similar to a human, the subhuman is lower on the spiritual and psychological scale than any animal. Not all of those who appear human are in fact so. Woe to him that forgets it." End quote. At work in this piece of Nazi propaganda is a subtle set of distinctions. Even if the Jew looks like a human, even if psychological, physiological, and behavioral features would immediately and obviously classify them as a member of Homo sapiens, they are not really human. They are below the human, subhuman, in precisely those categories that matter most for human life: spiritually, psychologically, or one could gloss, given the kind of larger subtext at play here, morally. Now, Smith draws upon evidence such as this, and there's a lot of it, along with a much larger body of historical, psychological, and also anthropological work, to offer the following definition of dehumanization. Here's how he defines it: to dehumanize another person is to conceive of them as a subhuman creature. I'll say that one more time. His definition of dehumanization is: to dehumanize another person is to conceive of them as a subhuman creature. Now, I'm going to return to this in more detail in the next section, but it's worth noting right away that this is a distinction which Singer himself employs, and to great effect. As Singer writes in his 1994 book, Rethinking Life and Death, quote, "Since neither a newborn human infant nor a fish is a person, the wrongness of killing such beings is not as great as the wrongness of killing a person," end quote. Now, Singer's argument can be rephrased in the following manner: a newborn human infant is both human insofar as it has features similar to a human physiologically, etc., and it's clearly biologically an offspring of a human, no one's questioning that, but it's also not human. It is subhuman in the more important spiritual, psychological, and let's say moral sense. The newborn human infant, like the fish for Peter Singer, is not a person. Now consider again David Livingstone Smith's definition. To dehumanize another person is to conceive of them as a subhuman creature. Now, as Smith notes, there is a lot to unpack in this definition, right? Every noun, every verb, even the syntax is all doing very specific work. And I encourage you to read his book, and also his newest book is going to be coming out, I think, next month, that even goes into even more depth. It's called Making Monsters. You can get it on Amazon, I think, right now. Now, what everyone makes of the particulars, I find one of the more important aspects of Smith's theory to be its explicit inclusion of a paradox, right? The dehumanized are considered to be both human in certain respects and not human in other, both and. And it is in the play of this tension that the dehumanized are rendered, the outcome of this, they're rendered not really a person, not really a being to whom, on most human moral theories, is accorded the usual sorts of regard and treatment. Now, upon first encountering research on dehumanization, one might be tempted to think that this is rare, right? Or unusual. This is an exception to the rule of how people treat and think about one another. And Smith and other people who work on this are so aware of this response that often a significant portion of this scholarship is devoted to simply laying out example after example of dehumanization at work. So to summarize this, really crudely, history shows dehumanization to be extremely common, right? Dehumanization is at play in the numerous genocides recorded in the Jewish Tanakh or the Christian Old Testament, also in the Quran. It's attested to in the 19th century Belgian genocide of the Congolese in the Congo Free State to the tune of well over 20 million people, the mid-20th century Nazi genocide of Jews and many others in Germany, the 1990s Hutu genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, or the contemporary ongoing, right now as we speak, genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar and of the Uyghurs in China. Now, once one takes the historical record seriously, a different response might arise. Well, why don't we just all agree that humans have intrinsic worth? Wouldn't a kind of fundamentalist approach to human value and to human rights fix this problem? Now, Richard Rorty, a number of years ago, he addressed this question head on. And I find his account, even though I don't ascribe to a lot of Rorty's views, I find his account of this particular question very illuminating. Here's how he puts it. Why is there so little resonance and so little point in asking whether human beings in fact have the rights listed in, say, the Helsinki Declaration? A simple answer is that between Kant's time and ours, Darwin argued most intellectuals out of the view that human beings contain some special added ingredient. He instead convinced most of us that we were exceptionally talented animals, right? Animals clever enough, or unfortunate enough, perhaps, to take charge of our own future evolution. Rorty continues, I think this answer is right as far as it goes, but it leads to a further question. Why did Darwin succeed, relatively speaking, so easily? Why did he not cause the creative philosophical ferment caused by people like Galileo and Newton a number of centuries earlier? Well, end quote. Well, he didn't cause such a ferment, Rorty suggests, because the line between divine selection and evolutionary selection is not as far and as radical as one might think. This was more of a shift of an existing view as opposed to a true Copernican revolution. Now, if this seems strange, Sylvia Wynter makes a strikingly similar point, though it probably makes it much better than Rorty, which is not surprising. Sylvia Wynter's scholarship demonstrates the proximity of this line, and she does so across the entirety of the contemporary modern Western intellectual tradition. So in an essay that I think is wildly understudied, in No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues, Sylvia Wynter responds to evidence that surfaced after the 1991 acquittal of the police after they beat nearly to death and tortured on camera Rodney King. During this process, this judiciary process, it was discovered that LA police would regularly refer to engagement with young Black males via the acronym NHI, which means No Humans Involved. Wynter argues, quote, the classificatory logic of the acronym NHI, as well as the belief system of a person like David Duke, for whom, whilst the Caucasian incarnates the ostensibly most highly evolved and selected mode of normal human being, the lower non-white races, and most ultimately the Negro, incarnate the most atavistic, non-evolved lack of the human. That was all one parentheses. The classificatory logic of the acronym NHI derives, therefore, from a secondary fallacy related to the above, one which underlies our present disciplinary paradigms and their hegemonic mode of economic rationality. This is the fallacy of supraculturalism, which mistakes our local culture's representation of the human as a natural organism. Right, so you hear there, what she means by local culture is our local modern evolutionary biological understanding of the human, as if it were the human in itself. it mistakes that representation for the reality, that map for the territory, end quote. In short, Winter is arguing that the modern scientific paradigm, right, and to be clear, that's one predicated not simply upon, say, the empiricism of Bacon, Galileo, or others, but a paradigm that fundamentally sets the stage for and defends a Darwinian understanding of what Marx calls our Gattungswesen, right, our species being. That paradigm is foundationalist. It doesn't treat its understanding of the human as a mere representation. It says this is what the human is. It assumes that it knows what the human is and can define the human instead of, for example, having to argue for what should qualify as the human. Obviously, we are just talented evolutionary organisms at the top of some proverbial, some variation of biological. You wouldn't, today, evolutionary biologists today wouldn't call it a chain, but let's say, I don't know, the biological order in a loose sense. Now, if the idea that we should simply posit or argue for what counts as human sounds strange, then perhaps you've not yet appreciated the import of human rights over the last 80 to 100 years, and also the scholarship on dehumanization, right? Historically, it seems to me relatively uncontroversial that we haven't, on a very wide scale, started treating at least some humans that are not part of our immediate in-group better, especially those we perceive to be unlike us. We haven't done that well through appeals to the divine or to nature, right? We have instead made some very minimal and only in some places amount of progress through claims about humanity as such, claims that have, crucially, emotional, affective, and evaluative components at play in addition to rational ones. Rorty, again, I think, offers some insights here. He argues, look, quote, the best and probably the only argument for putting foundationalism behind us is that it would be more efficient to do so, because it would let us concentrate, instead of arguing about the metaphysical substrate underlying humanity or questions of worth, it would let us concentrate our energies on manipulating sentiments, on feelings, on sentimental education. That sort of education, Rorty continues, sufficiently acquaints people of different kinds with one another so that they're less tempted to think of those different from themselves as only quasi-human. The goal of this manipulation of sentiment is to expand the reference of the terms our kind of people and people like us, end quote. In other words, Rorty thinks that once one realizes that human beings do not contain a special added ingredient, and once one also realizes how human beings in fact tend to think and treat one another, then the solution to cruelty, genocide, torture, and other forms of dehumanization is to better demarcate the target range of beings for whom we should care as people, whether these beings are human animals, non-human animals, or perhaps even non-animal beings like ecosystems or mountains, or fill in the blank. Next section, combating speciesism. So let us at this point return to the animating, no pun intended, problem. What, relative to the sort of conversation we're engaged in, are our actual aims? Right? Singer is very clear that he's hoping for a world where we treat certain non-human animals as well as we treat most human animals. And insofar as whatever sort of animal we're targeting, they're the ones that have a capacity to suffer. We're trying to minimize overall suffering. And of course, also maximize overall pleasure. But the focus on minimizing suffering is typically taken to be more important. Now, I hope for this too, right? I find it more or less uncontroversial that would be a more just world. What, though, is the sine qua non constraint nearly everyone who hopes for a more just world places on justice? Well, it is often the roughly utilitarian goal of the reduction of suffering. But we know that humans today and historically treat non-human animals, once you are placed in any sort of subhuman category, we treat those beings in terrifying, in sadistic, and in often ultimately indefensible ways that create enormous suffering. And if you spend even 5 minutes learning about what's going on with factory farming, this is just painfully apparent. So what then is the person worried about the treatment of non-human animals and also all human animals to do? Well, Singer explicitly acknowledges that there's at least 3 good solutions to solve this question. And he writes this a number of years after his earlier work. So I'm citing here from a piece that was published in 2010, but is based off a talk he gave in 2008. Here's the 3 options he gives. Preserve equality by raising the status of animals, granting them the same status we now grant to humans. Option 2, preserve equality by lowering the status of humans to that which we now grant to animals. Option 3, abandon the idea of the equal value of all humans, replacing it with a more graduated view in which moral status depends on some aspects of cognitive ability, and then take that graduated cognitive ability view and apply it to both humans and non-human animals. Now, Singer rejects 2, just is like, that's not workable. He defends 3, the 3rd option. And he admits he is to some extent sympathetic to option 1, but not in every respect. And from what I've read, I can't quite get a good handle on why what these not every respects are that he doesn't want to go with option 1. And I find this very worrisome for all the reasons I've been giving. And as Allie Peabody Smith rightly notes, she writes, quote, "We could preserve the equality of all humans and raise the status of some animals in order to defend a graduated moral picture like Singer's, but one where all humans make the cut." In other words, you could even take option 3, and if you demarcate what's going to count, if you define the cognitive ability view in such a manner that all humans are included, you can get the goal of 1 and 3 at the exact same time. Now, I think, I actually am a little hesitant to go with that variation. I think 1 is just better because, as I've probably already made clear, I think that a capacity-based view, even a very carefully constructed one, is irredeemable for some reasons I'll go into in a moment. But let's just back up for a second. Why wouldn't you choose option 1, right? What is the downside here? And I think that the framework against which I want to ask that somewhat rhetorical question is to note that it would be one thing if the social and political stakes of 1 and 3 were the same, right? And so choosing between the 2 were simply a question of some set of preferred reasons relative to whatever theory you like. But as I hope to have made abundantly clear at this point, the difference between 1 and 3 is the difference between explicitly and actively gearing into the psychological mechanisms that we know are at play in processes of dehumanization. That's what we're doing if we pick 3, or not if we pick 1. And to be clear, I said before, I'm still hesitant to do this modified version of 3 that still allows for 1 that Peabody Smith suggests. To be clear, part of the reason I'm hesitant to do that is that linking moral status to cognitive ability, however capaciously defined, is not simply a debated criterion or a debatable criterion. That is a criterion that has been historically used over and over again, precisely as a means of dehumanization, right? Specifically the dehumanization of already marginalized social groups as a way for majoritarian social groups to maintain control. We are seeing that in real time right now with Republican legislatures at the state level, many of them creating new obstacles to voting that are specifically based upon cognitive tests, right? I can't remember which state it is. I think it was Tennessee actually just introduced a bill that would require you to literally take a writing test to be able to get a voter ID that then would allow you to be able to vote. So when I say this has been used over and over and over again, I'm not exaggerating. It has. You see this in the 17th century, 18th century. You see it literally today. Now, it's not as though, and I want to be at least somewhat fair to Singer's, I guess, background knowledge regarding this stuff. It's not as though he's unaware of the way that various social groupings and demarcations can feed into domination and oppression. So consider, for example, this is from a 2019 interview he did with Vox. He says, quote, "I understand speciesism, like racism and sexism, as a prejudice that a more powerful group has against those who are less powerful. As a result of this prejudice, the more powerful group exploits the less powerful group for their own ends, and also adopt a whole set of ideas about the inferiority of less powerful groups. I think that does describe pretty clearly the way humans think about and act towards animals. Just as, for example, this is still him talking, it describes pretty clearly the way in which Europeans enslaved Africans, transported them across the United States, they were kidnapped, and sold them. I'm not saying this is a complete comparison in every respect, far from it, but I think those aspects of this prejudice do relate pretty clearly to racism of the kind that justified slavery." Now, what I find confusing here about Singer's comments, one of the things I find confusing, is although he is clearly on some level aware of questions of power and domination and oppression, he seems to have a complete lack of awareness of how dehumanization actually works, right? And more specifically, what research tells us were some of the primary psychological mechanisms that fostered the existence and creation and maintenance of something like the transatlantic slave trade, and fostered its creation, maintenance, and existence, mess the verbs up, anyway, across multiple continents and across multiple centuries. Those who engage, for example, in lynchings in the American South, did not simply think of Black people specifically, and especially Black men, who they mutilated and who they tortured for hours upon hours in front of crowds of often thousands that included families who came out to watch them. They didn't simply think of Black people in these contexts as less powerful or as less suitable for exploitation. Neither the desire for or the expediency of exploitation explains the cruelty of lynching, the cruelty of chattel slavery, or the cruelty at play in the acts of grotesque, unthinkable humiliation that are a part of nearly every genocidal event, right? You almost never simply see murder. You see murder and torture that is intended to humiliate the person who is being attacked. As Smith's research makes clear, prejudice and racism, yes, they are certainly a part of the justification of the sort of slavery at play in things like the Middle Passage. But to conclude that prejudice and racism are merely of a fold with speciesism, right, especially if thought along the lines of a simplistic, stronger, weaker, might decides right continuum, I think this just evidences a lack of understanding of human psychology and of human history, and also of what it would take to actually make the world more just. What it takes, people like David Livingstone Smith and Sylvia Wynter suggest, is taking what the human rights movement has provided, taking what we have learned about dehumanization, and using that to expand our orbit of care, not to start making gradated distinctions based upon categories that I would say are ultimately arbitrary, like cognitive ability. I'm running out of time here, so I was gonna, I had a paragraph or two gearing in what I'm saying to a care ethics framework, and how a care ethics framework provides a different model, one that's based upon questions of relationality and nested dependencies, a different model for thinking about the kind of normative bindingness or what it would be, what it takes to get people to care across quote unquote lines of species differentiation. I'm going to skip those two paragraphs, but I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Putting together the work of Smith and Winter, one can more clearly see, I think, the historical stakes of utilitarian arguments like that of Singer. The idea that humans are defined by their capacities is a founding premise behind the psychological processes of dehumanization, because it allows one to say that while someone might look, talk, walk, and otherwise seem like a human, they aren't really so, unless they have some more essential feature, namely the requisite capacities. If it is the case that we have good reasons, as I hope to have convinced you, from social psychology and intellectual history, that thinking of other humans as less than or not human, thinking of humans as being able to also not be persons, will provide fodder for dehumanization, then we have good reasons to jettison Singer's capacity-based view. This is especially so insofar as we actually lose nothing by instead taking up what on Peter Singer's own account is another way to solve the problem of non-human animal treatment, namely option 1, preserve equality by raising the status of non-human animals and granting them the same status we now grant to all human animals. Having now laid out how I see the problem of speciesism in relation to the problem of dehumanization, I want to address a few objections. I'm also going to cut this section a bit so that I slide in at the 45-minute mark. Here's one. I imagine there's lots of objections. It's what philosophers do for a living, among other things. But here's one of them. Let's call this the species-wide objection. So a critic might respond that a significant component of the history of racism, or history of particular forms of racialization, there is no one history of racism, but a significant component of this involves treating humans as involving distinct species, right? Higher and lower forms of the human, where lower species of the human have lower value that tie them to animals that are lower on the great chain of being. So this in fact supports the idea that we should get rid of the species line. Our focus should be getting rid of species differentiation, which presumably if you take option 1, you're holding on to species differentiation, you're just opening the ambit of people to whom we care, for whom we care. Now, I think this objection fails because it assumes that the species line is what's doing the primary psychological work in question. And I think that, and this is one of the things I find most fascinating about David Livingstone Smith's specific research, there are other variations and definitions of dehumanization that are different than his. But what is fascinating to me about his work is saying that what is doing the actual, the real force behind dehumanization is the peculiar category of the subhuman. It's the paradox of believing that someone can look, talk, fill in the blank, act like a human, and yet not be one. And insofar as that's right, and Smith might actually slightly disagree with me here, because I do think he maybe gives a kind of specific role to something like species differentiation that I'm not sure we need to. But what's doing the work is just holding two contradictory facts about a being we would otherwise treat to be human, holding them together, that they're human and not human. So it's not, in other words, I think, the species line that's truly doing the work there, or at least not relative to my interpretation of Smith's research. Here's another objection. Let's call this the existentialist objection. To place value in capacities, a critic might say to me, it's just far more defensible than upholding some category or some cognitive label of the human. Why? Well, a distinction based upon how a given being actually interfaces with and experiences the world, right? Especially if that distinction tracks things like pleasure and pain, which even people who don't like utilitarianism usually think that those things should have some sort of moral valence. Isn't that more defensible than a distinction that's ultimately based upon some taxonomic category, like human animal versus non-human animal? So I think this objection fails for the following reason. It begs the question by assuming that the category of the human is by definition or somehow necessarily itself a species line or a taxonomic distinction. We could define the human otherwise. We could define the human, as Eva Kate does, solely in terms of relationships. So it's not something that what makes you a human, there's no information from biology that tells us what makes you a human. What makes you a human is being some person's charge, right? You have a guardian, you have a parent, you have a caretaker, you have a mother or father, or fill in some other gender term. That is what actually constitutes the human. And insofar as that is the definition of the human, I think it gets around this criticism entirely. And it also allows us to say something like, I don't know, everyone is talking about their pets these days because we're all stuck indoors. Your cat or your dog is also a human in the morally relevant sense of being someone to whom there are moral obligations by virtue of an intimate relationship with them. Now, I realize that some people right there are going to be like, you can't expand the concept of the human that far, or once you do it, now it's lost all of its analytic value. Why don't we, jettison that term and say something like maybe personhood, or maybe that's too heavy. We could say something like whatever, fill in the blank. And I'm open to having that conversation. I think the term can be expanded. At least the term person can be expanded. Yeah, I mean, even in a legal context, right? There are places in the world where, for example, a mountain has been granted legal personhood. And in the United States, since Citizens United, corporations, which by the way, aren't humans, they're made up of humans, have had legal personhood for a long time. I think the concept of personhood can do this, even if someone thinks the concept of the human can't. And again, that I think I can allow that relative to the rest of my arguments. All right, I had two other objections. I need to skip them for time. I was going to talk about the particularist objection, this charge that's always levied against relational accounts that you care more for those in your orbit. I think that objection fails, but I'll keep you in suspense for why. There's another objection about what I call the scope objection. So this idea that part of where my a critic would say part of where my argument goes wrong is that dehumanization on Smith's count necessarily involves race. And part of the way that I'm using the term doesn't necessarily bring in questions of racialization. And I think that also fails for reasons that I'll leave you in suspense about. So how about, I'll skip to the end. Insofar as thinking about humans in ways that support the psychological processes of dehumanization, insofar as these ways of thinking fundamentally undermine the possibility for a just and equitable society, and insofar as they actively underwrite acts such as genocide as well as systemic oppression, then I think that such thinking is just a non-starter for those who wish to forward human rights. It is at this point that I'd like to return to the initial epigraph by Rosemary Garland Thompson. She writes, you'll remember, confused responses to racial or gender categories can provoke the question, what are you? Whereas disability interrogations typically provoke, what's wrong with you? Singer, Jeff McMahon, and others like them do not, to my knowledge, engage in the question, what are you? But they do engage in the question, what's wrong with you? And their engagement in that question results in certain persons not being treated as humans, and not being treated as humans as on all major moral theories are to be treated. What are you and what's wrong with you are different in degree, not kind, when it comes to the stakes of human rights and how we establish the lines of our moral universe. We've come to a historical point where it is, on the whole, just inadmissible to seriously ask, what are you, to someone who looks different than one, acts different than one, engages in sexual practices different than one, comes from a different place than one does. It's inadmissible because we understand now, and should have always, that racism, sexism, cissexism, xenophobia, and all other sorts of dehumanizing attitudes are at play in such a question. But we have yet to come to a point where it is inadmissible to ask, what's wrong with you? And yet, if dehumanization is to be stopped, we must. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I believe it is Q&A time. How I'd like to do this is you might see that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you could include a request for your question as well as your status as, say, an undergraduate student, a graduate student, faculty, or you're here in some other capacity, please include that to prevent any awkwardness. I'll be ordering this so that students go first. So yeah.
I should add that I'm pretty sure my parents are listening, but I told them they need to ask me after, because they can ask me one-on-one.
All right, we will honor that. All right, so while others trickle in, I see the one question from a graduate student, Anastasia. I will give you the floor.
Hi, can I speak now?
Yes.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I think everything you shared is really on point. So my question is about dehumanization and like sort of the ways to understand it, or perhaps the alternative ways to understand it, both in psychology and philosophy. So there is one way to think about it, and the atrocities that come with it, sort of as a product of seeing somebody as less than human. And on that view, it seems plausible that presenting people or a group of people in certain ways can result in dehumanization. So for example, presenting someone as disgusting or vermin-like, as in a lot of Nazi propaganda, that seemed to result in some people's failure to recognize humanity of the other, and perhaps as a result, treat them in the ways that we typically find to be horrifying. But I think there's another way to potentially think about dehumanization, like the process that people choose to actively engage in. So I'm thinking about some ways to think about rape, specifically combat rape, which tends to be terrifyingly violent and cruel. And some people argue that in these cases, it isn't really the failure to recognize one's humanity, which results in dehumanization and violence that comes with it, but rather recognizing the other's humanity is a prerequisite for the aim of this dehumanizing process. So what's so kind of shocking and I'd say devastating about it is that the people who engage in that kind of combat rape, they recognize that the enemies are human, and that would be a humiliating kind of process of actively stripping them of their humanhood, of their personhood. And I think psychologist Paul Bloom kind of also talks about it a bit, but it seems kind of scary because it's not really the failure in those cases to perceive humanity that seems to drive those atrocities. So it might not be a good fix to, it might not be helpful to allow others to recognize the other's humanity. It seems they do recognize it. Yeah. And on the basis of that recognition, it's what allows them to engage in those dehumanizing acts. So I'm wondering if that way of thinking about some cases of dehumanization, at least, how that could enter the kind of view that you're defending here.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much for raising that question. Yeah, what to do about cases where it seems as though people are recognizing the humanity of the other person, but then actively trying to strip it from them, or to treat them less than human, even though they know they are human. I mean, my initial thought is to say, I don't know if I have any concrete tools from what I've said today to to think about or to stop those sort of cases, because that seems like the person is now outside of the realm in which I'm talking, right? I have been assuming from the outset that if you think someone's human, you would never do something like that, right? And insofar as it's the case that someone could find another person to be human and still do things like that to them, as in combat rape, I'm not sure I have anything to say except that that's terrifying. I don't know how to, I mean, I'm not going to say that that's, yeah, I think that moves into a realm of, I don't know if we want to call it cruelty or if we want to call it what, that I just don't, yeah, I don't know if I have anything intelligent to say about that. Do you have, is this an area that you work on? Do you have some thoughts of how this might, what could be, yeah.
Well, I studied dehumanization involved in propaganda, like Nazi kind of propaganda, and how disgust can influence people's tendencies to, well, socially exclude others mostly. But I was thinking about in terms of rape, because it seems that when we're trying to think about interventions, I think a lot of it is focused on trying to get others to recognize the other's humanity through, invoking empathy of some sort. But it seems to me that in a lot of cases of rape more generally, like in especially in those kind of violent cases of rape, not necessarily even combat rape, it's not, I think one of the motivations there might be this question of gaining power by stripping the other of their humanity. And so it seems to me that all of those interventions that are trying to make the perpetrators aware of the victim's humanity might be misguided or not successful, because that's really having gained control over that humanity by having taken it away from them, what seems to drive those people's motivations for assaulting their victims.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, maybe the one thing I could say is that even though what I've been arguing doesn't really help in any explicit way to think through those cases or to get people who would do something like that to see someone as a human, if what I would add is that if you hold on to a view like Singer's, it would make it, or I think, or I hope to have argued, that it would make it easier to hold on to the idea that the person is both human and not human, and that, maybe you're more justified in taking power from them if there is still the capacity for holding on to the paradoxes of dehumanization, namely such that even though you recognize that the person is, you recognize that the being is a human, and yet they're not fully a person, because I don't know, assumptions about their intellectual capacity, assumption if they're, clearly in these cases, or at least it seems in these cases, there's issues of misogyny and patriarchy and toxic masculinity at play. I think that shutting down the possibility of holding the paradox of dehumanization, as Smith puts it, is shutting down one more route that could assist in these sorts of process. But I think you are absolutely right that there might be something distinctive going on there. And maybe it is just true that some of these people engaging in these actions see the person as fully a person and are doing these horrendous acts precisely in order to gain power. And yeah, I don't know how you solve that. So yeah, thank you. That's a really important addition to think about. So thank you for that question and comment.
Thank you so much.
All right, next, Ben has a question. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me? Awesome. So I have actually two questions. If we can only get the one, that's perfectly fine. So the first one is on your like root one or case one or however you framed it. I forget exactly. So essentially, like if you don't use cognitive capacity, and I know a lot of animal rights theorists and vegan activists and people like this use capacity for suffering as their like sort of benchmark relevant characteristic morally. Well, capacity for suffering is in a way a cognitive capacity. You could say cognitive capacity for suffering. If this is not what you take to be relevant, then what is relevant for treating a living being some way or not? Yeah. Like basically, do we have to be Janist? And if not, why exactly? That isn't a reason that's contingent in some way on the moral relevance of cognitive capacity, again, e.g. for suffering. And then like maybe a parallel point to that would be like, if not for cognitive capacities, what lets us turn off life support, right? For people who are, in sort of somewhat sort of medically brain dead or whatever. And then the second point is on sort of your more general thesis, which is that it is very much true that using cognitive capacity as morally relevant has been used horribly in the past. And then it's like undeniable if you look at history. But it's also true that like argumentative rhetoric, or rather argumentation in general, has been used for horrible means in the past. And yet that's really what we as philosophers do. That's kind of like all we do, but we do it carefully, right? We like there's a specific care that we take when doing argumentation, even though like argumentative rhetoric has been used in horrible ways in the past. So my question is like, is there no way to do this, i.e. using cognitive capacity as a morally relevant characteristic carefully, in much the same way that we argue carefully, whereas most people argue in very non-careful ways? Yeah.
Great, thanks for both of those questions. Let me go in reverse order because the second one I think is easier to answer. To shift, so I think there's it's a different domain when we're talking about the use of quote unquote intellectual capacity with regards to a discrete set of practices that go under a heading like argumentation. When we're talking about praiseworthy or blameworthy argumentation, we're in a different realm, I think, than tying moral worth to the existence of a capacity where that capacity is understood, not in terms of whether or not you're using it well, but in terms of whether or not you are able to use it. It is something you will have. And this is why, I had to cut this for time, but I had this whole complaint over the main phrase that Singer and McMahon and others use of, was it severely to profoundly cognitively disabled. This is the catchphrase that occurs over and over and over again. And I always like reminding people that like, that's not a meaningful category. That's not like a diagnostic. You don't find that in the DSM. That is a gerrymandered umbrella term that they use to kind of hand wave to a set of people who they think don't have the potential to either to engage in certain sorts of activities, regardless of whether or not they do it well, poorly, or wellly. You know what I meant to say. So I think that that's just a different set of questions. And I don't think that making a claim about where we should place moral worth, and as I'm arguing, we shouldn't place it in cognitive capacity, therefore implies that philosophers can't do good stuff, or that there's not still value in cognitive capacity. I don't think that, I certainly didn't mean to make that follow. I don't think it follows. The first question you asked, yeah, this is a rough one. This is a really, if I bite the bullet and I say, I don't want to make the capacity for suffering be a primary part of my moral kind of whatever calculus, whatever you want to call it, that really upsets a lot of people because of how useful that has been to get certain things done and see certain beings, I don't know, cephalopods, corvid, pick your category, see them as important, or hell, just any number of primates. But I am willing to bite that bullet. And part of the reason I'm willing to has to do with this larger argument about ableism that I still haven't, I can't even really give you the cliff notes right now because I still have to think this through, but the idea runs something like this. Metaphysically, it's indefensible to argue that there's something like individual capacity or individual ability. Abilities and capacities are not the sort of thing that are qualities, that are not qualities, characteristics, or features of individuals. They're qualities, characteristics, or features of interactions and relationships. They are, so I'm thinking of like, this forces you to go into work in philosophy of action. People like Barbara Vetter on the concept of abilities as dispositions. This also throws you into the ecological psychology literature, like J.J. Gibson and how he talks about affordances. And it's like, look, I do not have the ability to pick up the cup unless the cup affords itself to me as something to be able to be picked up. It's a question of the relationship of an organism with the environment. And whatever ability or capacity is, it cannot be thought, it has to be thought in this, I mean, pick your favorite term, relational, ecological, you could maybe even say systems level idea. Now, insofar as I'm willing to bite that bullet and make that more radical claim, I think that suffering can actually come back into the picture, but now it will not be the suffering of an individual organism or being, because suffering is the sort of capacity that will not track to them. It will track to a relationship with an environment. And interestingly, this might mean that there are cases where, for example, we would say we need to care about some set of beings that we don't think on a Singer view have the capacity for suffering. I don't know, cockroaches. But maybe when we think about the role of the cockroaches relative to the ecosystem in a particular environment, we say actually their role and the suffering at a systems level that would occur if we treat these beings in this way, maybe, I don't know, we eradicate them all from Earth, and the next thing you know, the entire food chain is disrupted, and then like it sets off this cascade, I'm being hyperbolic, but you get my point. That's where we then, that's the level at which we then place the suffering. That's where I want to go. To convince you of that, obviously, or to convince anyone of that would require way more work, and hopefully, maybe the Meaning of Disability book that's coming out with Oxford, I'll have a slightly better answer for you. Time will tell. I hope so.
Thank you for that.
All right, Tom.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, first, thanks so much, Dr. Reynolds. I really enjoyed this talk. I wanted to ask about a point related to Singer. So obviously Singer has like an unusually broad allowance for infanticide, and particularly, obviously, that's probably going to impact disabled infants the most. But I was wondering if, so given that the permission of infanticide for disabled infants is one of many factors that contributes to the sort of dehumanization of disabled persons that goes on, would this also apply to other sorts of like preferences among infants? Like, say, if a couple were to have a baby with like a certain characteristic, like physical characteristic or whatever that they didn't like, Singer has defended like infanticide on those bases too, in certain instances. And so would that be like a similar sort of dehumanization based on those characteristics, or is it distinct in some conceptual way from cases of infanticide with disability? Thanks.
Great question. That's very interesting. Yeah, and it's worth noting. It sounds like you know this, but it's easy to focus on the infanticide stuff. But of course, there's many more implications for this. Like if your mother or father or someone you love that's older gets Alzheimer's or any number of forms of dementia, they can end up in a state that maps pretty directly onto this gerrymandered category of severe to profound cognitive disability. And interestingly, when Singer's own mom, if I have the story correctly, got Alzheimer's, and in an interview, he was kind of like, yeah, I've been realized my views might have some worrisome implications about, you know, the permissibility of killing my mom. He didn't, I'm paraphrasing. It's telling to me. Also, there's also implications. I just want to add this because it's important. Persistent vegetative state is still a highly contested category. There's work by neurologists like Joseph J. Fins, who is arguing that a lot of what we used to call PVS, there's actually multiple distinctions within that. And there are some people that are what is called a minimally conscious state, who we thought, because we didn't have the kind of tools for both diagnostically and other reasons, we thought there was no chance for their brain to recover. And now we're finding that they might be able to. And yet on Singer's own view, like, of course, we should just let those people go. So it's, yeah, there's lots of implications of his view that go beyond infants and infanticide. That's all I wanted to flag. To answer your specific question, which is great, insofar as these other characteristics are conceptually, are I don't know how to phrase this, are conceived of in terms of capacities that will correlate to quality of life, then I think that it's actually the same thing going on. So you could imagine arguments being made about height. You could imagine arguments being made about, I don't know, any number of things where the parent goes, well, I would prefer if the child were X, had X characteristic, insofar as that will tend to make their life go better on some given view of quality of life. And I think formally, that's just, it's essentially the same thing. It's the same sort of argument. It's just now being tacked to a slightly different thing than cognitive capacity. You know, I've read some of this stuff. I mean, it's hard for me to keep my neutral philosopher hat on when I talk about this stuff. But, you know, I mean, Singer's just made these comments like, oh, if you have a kid with Down syndrome, of course they're not normal. And why would parents want a kid with Down syndrome? And so as far as they're abnormal, that should give you reasons to want a different child. And I just can't, you know, there's a point at which I like the philosopher hat goes off because I just want to be like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, it is hard for me to even begin to explain how many ableist assumptions have to be operative for a person to claim that just because their child is different from them in various ways, that actually provides moral reasons for them to not prefer that child. I just can't, I don't even know where to start with that. But he said it multiple times, variations of that sort of a claim multiple times. I think he even said, and this was an interview in, it was in German, but it's easy to translate, in like, I don't know, 2016. And he was like, if my parents, you know, could have had me, but with better vision, wouldn't they want that? And I'm just like, this is not, I'm like, God, I'm glad Peter Singer's not my dad. Like, this is not how parenting works. Like, this is not like, loving a child and raising a child is not like going to the mall and picking your favorite. I just don't, like, what is going on here that this is how you're thinking about the responsibilities of parenting? I don't know. Yeah, it's very hard. I just, at a certain point, I don't even know where to begin. And this is one of these topics where I'm like, I don't even know where to begin. When he says, of course you want a child who's like you. You know, like I said before, when I read that, I'm like, well, I'm glad you're not my dad.
All right, we have a question from Lynn.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. I have actually two questions, I think, that different question. Well, if I understand it correctly, the argument or the theory that you that you think works is a theory that grounds the value of human in relationships. But I have intuition that whether like grounding the value of humans in relationships risk denying the value of humans in themselves. What I mean, just to give an example, this is what philosophers like to do when they think about like thought experiments. For example, one version of trolley problem like is the transplant organ, that example. So the philosopher just conceive a person that has no friends and whose parents had died and can disappear without being noticed by any single individual in the world. Then if this person just have no relationship with other people, then can we just deny the value of him?
Great. Was that the end of the question?
No, I have another question.
Okay.
Okay, another question is somewhat related to the first question. I think Singer does not only argue for the rights of animals like dogs or cats that have special relationship with human. He also argues for the right of animals like chicken or those are not normally raised by human, but are also able to feel pain. And so some I can imagine some people argue that though this first approach can somewhat like support anti-speciesism, but the scope of like application is smaller than the one that's proposed by Singer. That's the end of the question.
Yes, let me start with the first one. Yeah, so that's great. This is also a problem that Eva Kate has dealt with. You know, that phrase in the title of the paper, "We're all somebody's child." I was riffing off of Eva Kate's "We're all some mother's child," and in her defense of that kind of the role that she gives that sort of claim in her version of care ethics, she's had to deal with people saying, well, what if, you know, the child is orphaned? Or, I mean, heck, go to Oedipus Rex, right? The kid is left out in the field and no shepherd comes to pick him up, and then we never get that tragedy written. You know, it doesn't seem true that everyone has guardians such that they're in a relationship of care in the way that maybe we would all ideally hope everyone has. And if you want to read Eva Kate's, I think probably her clearest response to this is a piece called "Equality, Dignity, and Disability." Came out in 2005, and you can see how she deals with the problem there. But the way I deal with it is as follows. Even if someone has no interpersonal relationships, let's imagine someone who just became homeless, I don't know, and they've lost all their friends, I don't know. Again, this is bordering on a thought experiment that's not going to track reality. They are still in a relationship with people, right? Homelessness is a social category. We have decided in the United States, we've decided to allow people to go unhomed. We've decided to allow, let's bracket non-citizens for a second. We've decided to allow citizens to be in a relationship with the federal and state government such that if they do not have certain means, they are ejected from the social order. That is a choice. But even in that situation, they're still in a relationship with other people relative to the social order, even if there's no one individual who is actively caring for them. And I think that the really provocative and revolutionary version of care ethics that I am fond of says that care is not just a feature of interpersonal relationships. Care is a feature of the world in which we live. And it goes way beyond just interpersonal stuff. care is also a feature of the environment, right? And the extent to which there are these cycles of growth and decay and nourishment and all of this stuff. And I think it's hard to part of the reason it's hard to, part of the difficulty here is in that word care. We hear that, I think it's easy to hear that term in a hyper-humanistic way. I think it's also easy to hear that term in a way that assumes a certain positive valence to it. Like, you can care for someone by hurting them, right? I mean, think about, heck, any number of surgeries where like you have to just do massive amounts of damage to the person's body in order to save them. Or think about the role of certain types of disciplining take that in a neutral sense, or certain types of responses where we push back against what someone wants or do. Care isn't necessarily this loose, happy-go-lucky thing. Care also involves these practices that can be, in certain respects, experienced as negative. I ran down the word association rabbit hole, and now I've forgotten your second question. Can you give me your second question again? I'm sorry.
Okay, my second question is related to the first question. My worry is that a theory that based value in terms of relationship might make some animal that Singer argues worth moral consideration not valuable, such as chickens that are not raised by human and have no relationship with human.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. And part of this does have to do with maybe a constraint of theory building that I myself normally am angry about, but I'm probably engaging in it. I'm guilty of it right now, where I'm starting with a problem. I'm trying to start from the problem of dehumanization, and not a clean version of that, but the problem of dehumanization as it presents itself in particular historical contexts. And I'm saying, given how bad this problem is, what sort of view would we not simply need to have in our heads, but what sort of view would generate practices that address this problem? It might turn out that the answer, that by starting there, we end up in a case where the animals you just described aren't cared for. And maybe that's a bullet I have to bite and say, yep, I can't get all the way there. And to get all the way there, I have to start with a different problem, or I have to build in some extra premises near the beginning to get to that. Now, I'm not saying that's the case because I'm not sure. I think maybe there's still a way on this, whatever you want to call it, ecological relational view to care about these, I think you said chickens. There might be a way. I don't have a good answer for you right now, but I will keep thinking about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Connor?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi.
Okay, so thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really great. I think you do a really good job of pointing to some of the many problems with dehumanization. And the question I'm about to ask verges on like the completely unrealistic thought experiment part of philosophy, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. So it seems to me that dehumanization could be something that is useful in a very, very narrow set of circumstances. So for example, if an individual were to have a child who was born a moral monster, like programmed to violate the rightful claims of others, to be consistently negligent, to be terribly racist, terribly ableist, and all of the terrible ways that we would normally condemn. somebody who is trying to defend the idea of dehumanization in a narrow set of circumstances might say, it might be worth trying to point out that person as an anti-exemplar that is outside of humanity, and that we can get people to understand through their actions, like what is wrong about the things that they do. So then I wonder if there was somebody who was a moral monster minus one behavior, and then we kept doing that. I'm curious to see whether or not there is a point at which it makes sense to say, these people are so morally egregious that we should cast them outside of the circle of humanity. If that isn't the sort of thing that seems valuable to you in any circumstances whatsoever, I'd like to hear a little bit more about why. Yeah, that's the question roughly.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure you'll like the answer, but I will directly answer it. So two pieces maybe. The first one is this, when you said, you admitted it's a thought experiment, and my first response is just to say, I don't think there are moral monsters. I don't think anyone is born like that. And I don't care who you, Hitler, whatever, pick your, like, I don't think that that's how humans work. I also think, I immediately think of Hannah Arendt's writings, and specifically her stuff on the banality of evil and the Eichmann trial. And I find it really one of the more important insights that Arendt shows through her work is that by holding on to a certain type of concept of evil, and by holding on to a certain type of concept of moral monsters, Hitler, Pol Pot, Stalin, whatever, fill in the blank, we actually mistake the fact that some of the most horrendous acts that have ever been carried out were just carried out by your average everyday person who was just doing what they were told, or just, and we just, I'm not going to get too political here, but the previous administration, there were a number of decisions made, including ramping up, putting children in what were essentially concentration camps and splitting them from their families, which we know is one of the most traumatizing things you can possibly do, and is, on almost every definition, a sort of war crime. And there was a significant portion of the US population who just went, and kept supporting the administration in general, despite that policy. And so I think it's actually pretty important from where I'm sitting, it's actually important. I think we should just get rid of the category of evil. And I don't think there are such things as moral monsters in the world. And I don't want to live in a society where at a certain point we just throw you out. I think the best form society would be one in which rehabilitation and various humane ways of dealing with people is what we do, period. We don't just, and also where are you going to send people? I mean, this is about as, we're only going to get more globalized over time. Like we've run out of islands to just maroon people on. So if we're all in this together, we need to figure out ways to deal with people who do absolutely horrendous things. And I think we need to do that in a way that still sees them as humans and doesn't see them as so far from the pale that they aren't even, they aren't persons anymore. And that's a very hard pill. Again, I keep saying bite the bullet. I don't know why that metaphor keeps popping up today, but that is a very hard thing for people to accept. I just think the alternative is actually morally indefensible. Even if it's hard to accept, I just think the other direction leads you into a world that I don't think is defensively just.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Dr. Freeman.
Oh, hello. Thanks so much for the work that you're doing, the justice work you're doing. I appreciate it. I wanted to just ask, you kind of alluded to this, but why not make sentience the morally relevant category? Because normally in my critical analysis studies work, I talk a lot about sentient beings, because even though, as a former commenter mentioned, that it is a capacity and that can be problematic, it's so broad, the notion of sentience, that almost every animal species qualifies.
Right.
So I wanted to just ask that.
Yeah, I mean, if your use of the term sentience is this extremely permissive, extremely broad one, I might be more open to it in principle. But I think the part where I would still hesitate is in this idea that sentience tracks. Sentience is a property or a characteristic of an individual organism outside of thinking its place in relationship to a particular environment. And I'm thinking, I'm by no means, I'm very much a beginner when it comes to indigenous philosophy. I have an amazing colleague, Dr. Shelby Meissner here, who's working on indigenous thought. I was taught by a number of years ago an indigenous scholar, Dr. Adam Erla, and one of the things that I took away from my limited understanding of some of that work is the way that quote unquote Western understandings of individuals can so easily run you into problems where, for example, we can't articulate why a certain mountain is sacred, or if you don't like the religious language, why a certain mountain should be protected. We can't articulate anymore why, I don't know, the air quality is of moral import, right? Because I'm not sure anyone thinks air is sentient. I'm not really sure. But anyway, the idea being, I just worry that sentience can be, maybe doesn't have to be, can be tied to a certain long-standing prejudice in the Western intellectual tradition that there's something like reason. I mean, sentience is obviously way lower than reason, but there's something about, let's just say, awareness that should be valued above and beyond, should maybe either necessarily or usually be valued above and beyond the relations in which we actually find ourselves. Again, all of that, you probably have a really good response to that. And maybe the way you use sentience actually avoids all of these problems I just said. I still, the one thing I will hold on to, and I know it is in some ways radical, I just don't, I do not think that the concept of individual capacity is defensible for me. And so if sentience is an individual capacity, then right there, I'm going to go, I would have to reframe this in a different way for me to buy on. But I haven't given the full arguments for that. So I realize it sounds perhaps absurd. I'm not really sure how it sounds, but definitely weird. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I don't know. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, do you want to respond?
Oh yeah, I actually was thinking, now I lost my train of thought trying to figure out how to unmute. Okay. How about I switch over to a second question that I had. I don't know if you're familiar with Af and Sil Coe's work. They wrote a book called Afroism. Afroism, yeah. And it's really, it's kind of like Black vegan studies. And they're just doing such, I think, such phenomenal thought work around the idea. They're making an argument that the animal protection movement should actually function within the larger movement for racial justice, because it's all a part of a fight against white supremacy. Because as you noted in the idea of, because white supremacy is what's done most of the work in the idea of making anyone subhuman and dehumanizing. So I'm finding some of the race theory, when people are combining like critical animal studies and like critical race theory, they're coming up with some really interesting ways that we could work together and to reframe the problem. So anyway, I just wanted to introduce that to you because it's something new I'm reading about that I find really fascinating.
Thank you for that suggestion. I haven't read that book. I'll look it up. And what you just said though makes me think of people like Excel Carrera at Emory University, people like Ryan Fix at Wesleyan, obviously work by people like Carrie Wolf going back a number of years. And the linking of questions of racialization, specifically as that's been a process of white supremacy and global centuries upon centuries of colonization and imperialism, I think that's definitely something that needs to be thought about further. And I look to those people to kind of teach me about it, and I need to read more. So thank you very much for bringing that up. I'll definitely read that book. Yeah, there's a whole different argument against Singer that I didn't make. I don't think Eva Kate makes it. I don't think it, where he's explicitly gearing into histories of white supremacy and the history of white supremacy in the United States, specifically with regards to the eugenics movement. And that whole history, I mean, I've never read anything that suggests to me Singer has read about the eugenics movement in the US and Britain, and how, I mean, as everyone who knows a little bit about this, the Germans stole the ideas from us. They just were like, oh, the Americans have this down. And that was the framework for the Shoah was just taken from the Americans and the Brits at the policy level. Anyway, there's another set of historical arguments to be made that the capacities-based view, as Singer articulates it, gears into very directly the history of white supremacy in the United States, at minimum, if not in many other places. But I did not give that argument, so I will stop talking now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for this talk. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you again, Dr. Reynolds, for your answers to those questions. I will now turn to Gabby.
All right, thank you everybody for the questions, and thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for the amazing talk. This gives us all something to think about. And also we apologize that we do have limited time, so we didn't get to your parents' question, like later.
They'll ask me later.
Yeah, just a quick reminder, we have another event coming up on March 26th by Jose Mendoza. He's going to give us a talk on go back to where you came from, racism, white nationalism, and xenophobia. So the registration will be available next week. So make sure you sign up for it. And
Jose Mendoza is awesome and brilliant. Do not miss that talk. He is great.
Yes, exactly. All right. Thank everybody for coming, and hope you guys have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.